Today, I'm going to be talking about 10 of the factors. I didn't want to say the 10 factors because these aren't the only factors, but this is 10 factors to consider when you're choosing international school. Um, I've been overseas for over 20 years, teaching in Turkey, Oman, Korea, and then I was an administrator in Korea and China and Mexico. So I feel like I've had a nice breadth of experience with a lot of different types of schools, and and this is kind of has come from a few sources, and I'll talk about those in just a bit. But these are the 10 factors. So today's webinar is going to include the presentation of the 10 factors and then a Q&A session, which will not be recorded. So I will stop the recording just at the end of my presentation. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat function. It should only come to me, but I actually haven't checked those settings recently, but I think it should only come to me. But we're, at a small group, and I think, any question that you have, someone else might also have. So this is the rundown, and this screen will be showed at the end as well. So you could also screenshot it if you're interested. I will be sharing this presentation in a PDF format, but it won't be very rich with information because it's more the talking part that's going to be informative. But these are the rundown of the 10 factors, and I'll go through each one individually. So when you're considering an international school, and I think I'm talking to a few very experienced teachers today, but as this is being recorded and putting on YouTube, I'm going to start with absolute new teachers overseas. There's essentially two student populations we're seeing in international schools these days. We're seeing international students. That's who the schools were made for originally. And then we're now starting to see a very large population of local students coming into the international schools system to have a better education, to have sort of a leg up on other local student when it's competing for university placements. So it's interesting, and it's something to consider when you're choosing your school, to ask what percentage of the students are international and what percentage are local. And then furthermore, to ask how many different nationalities, because what they might consider international might be, so for example, in the Gulf, they might consider, obviously, all international students will be lumped in, but there might be 60% Arab students and then 30% local. So in fact, you're going to have 90% Arab speaking students, which can change the dynamic of a school, as opposed to an international school that might have 54 nationalities, 98% international. That will have a very different school culture. So this is always something that you want to ask either during your interview or before, if you have that opportunity, or even just through research, through checking out the school's website. The next thing you want to consider is teaching staff. So most teaching staff, if you or yourself are being recruited at an international school, most likely you will be the only one. So there will be a component of international staff, but there will also be likely a local component, and they could be teaching exactly the same as you. So in the international departments, what I kind of consider international departments would be English, math, science. Social studies can be a little bit of both. It might be local and in the local language, or it might be international, IB, economics and history and that kind of thing. So it's always interesting to ask what percentage or number of international staff versus local staff do they have? It could very well be completely international staff, and the local staff are simply educational assistants or the administrative help or support. So it's always very telling. And then it's something to consider, what kind of international staff. So do they have a diverse, multi-ethnic, multicultural staff? I've always enjoyed working with that kind of a school, simply because it enriches the students' experience, but also your own experience from a point of view of, wanting to know more about the world. As international teachers, we go overseas because we're curious. So if we have an international staff that's extremely diverse, or we might have an international staff that is extremely focused on maybe one or two nationalities. I'm thinking things like British schools, American schools, Canadian schools, might be something like that, Australian schools as well. So the third factor you might want to consider, or you actually do really want to consider, is it nonprofit versus for profit? And this is kind of a touchy topic because it deals with money, but it's also, it can be viewed very negatively when, if you were just to sort of blurt it out during an interview with a head of school saying, "Hey, so is this school for profit?" There might be a better way to phrase that. But the nonprofits characteristics are, they take all the tuition and they put it right back into the school. And that would be covering primarily teachers' salaries. That is the biggest expenditure. Also professional development. They often have an allowance that maybe you have to apply for, or maybe you're guaranteed every year. Um, they also put the money back into infrastructure or expansion of facilities, adding a swimming pool or adding an auditorium. And they also put that money back into resources. So not just textbooks, but programs, so literacy programs or math programs. And so the nonprofit characteristics are very positive because they're consistently reinvesting into their school for the improvement of the school. The for profit may have all those characteristics, may have some of those characteristics, but it also, because it's a business, they're looking at, the money gets diverted. So some of the money goes back to the school for all those things I mentioned. And sometimes they, or not sometimes, if they're for profit, they go into bank accounts. And that might be the school owners, that might be the um, board of investors, it could be the board of directors. And so when we're looking at for-profit schools, oftentimes because of that diversion, they might not have all those nonprofit characteristics. I've worked for a number of for-profit schools that have had problems with resources. They've had problems with staff retention because salaries are capped or salaries are low, and they don't give many stipends, and so staff end up feeling a little bit undervalued perhaps, and move on. So the for profit and nonprofit is a really important question. The fourth factor is, what curriculum are they offering? And I don't want to say that most schools do only one, because what we're seeing now, the trend is offering many different curricula, and which is almost like a hybrid, or splitting their focus on many different curricula. And that can be problematic for teachers who have to wear many different hats. Primarily we're seeing IB is the International Baccalaureate. It's based out of Switzerland. I think many of you probably know. It's very easy to find out more information on that, so I don't want to go too much into that, but this is kind of the gold standard of international school curriculum. But then there's also the English speaking countries curriculum. I've mentioned British, American, Canadian. Canadian, of course, is not, I'm Canadian, so it's not national, but it's provincially based, but they're usually accredited through a province Ministry of Education. They have Australian. I've even seen Singapore international schools, but I'm not entirely sure if they're accredited through Singapore or if they just use the name Singapore for marketing purposes. And then the third option is, of course, the schools, these international schools might also offer the local country national curriculum. They might be mandated to do so. I've worked at a few schools where they had to marry the national curriculum with the IB, or the national curriculum with the American curriculum. And so that can also be a challenge. So that's something to consider when you're choosing your international school, is how confident do you feel in the one curriculum they're offering, so IB or the the English speaking curriculum, and then your ability to sort of weave in the national curriculum. Oftentimes that can also be challenging because it might not be in English, so the actual documents might be in the local language, and if it's a newer school, they might not have translated them. So you'll be relying very much on the local teachers for help. So that's something to consider. The assistance offered. So I kind of divided this into like very different categories. So from an HR point of view, if this is your first international school or your first, your first few international schools, it can be very daunting moving overseas. And so if you have a really supportive HR department that's taking everything and organizing it all for you, your work visas, your home, your shipment allowance, if you get one, your transportation, so booking your flights, you can feel very taken care of. And that's that allows you to move stress free. But I've seen it run the gamut where HR is been one person and they do very little with that kind of support. So then you're booking your own flight, you're figuring out how to get from the airport to a house or a hotel, and then you're finding your own apartment. So I've seen everything, and that's something that you want to consider and you want to ask about. How much help are you going to get from HR? And then once you're moved, the other option, the other thing to consider is all the bills, all the medical insurance. Are you needing to do that yourself, or is there support at the school for that? The number two is so considering or asking about what kind of orientation do they have for new faculty. So again, I've seen, a fantastic welcoming committee made up of teachers from, various backgrounds and many years at the school, a new faculty coordinator who's often an international teacher or a local teacher, and they create activities for you and a whole week of orientation perhaps. They get you settled in, they tell you where you can shop. They're there to help that whole transition from your previous country or your home country to the new country. And so they're answering questions and answering emails. I also have seen schools with nothing, absolutely nothing. And then you're kind of left with maybe talking with a teacher that they've put you in contact with, or with the HR department. So this is something to ask and to consider. If you're a teacher that needs a little bit more support or wants that transition to be smoother, ask them how they greet, or they how they orient the new staff, the new faculty. And then the third one is completely different. This is in the classroom. This is how much assistance is offered to you in the classroom. So if you're a science teacher, do you have a lab assistant? Or any other kind of teacher, do you have an educational assistant? Oftentimes, they might hire local teachers that are just starting out on their career, or maybe newly graduated from their local university education programs, and they offer them a year or 2-year contract to come into the classrooms and be that extra set of hands. And then you're essentially responsible for their work day, setting up their schedule and just saying, hey, I'm going to need your help on, these particular tasks. And it's a little bit of a learning curve, working with somebody that may not speak English so fluently, and you're working with them in tandem with the students. But it can also be a great help to have that extra set of hands, for supervision and things like that. So that's something to ask your school about. So the sixth factor is location. So I haven't considered that too much. I've always been rather open, but there are teachers or international teachers that have specific locations that they only want to live in. So this is where this comes from. So one thing to maybe consider is how far is it from home, what you consider home. If you have an emergency with a family member, or suddenly you need to go home, how far is it? How difficult is it to get home in an emergency situation? That might be a consideration. For me, future visitors, family and friends want to come visit or might not want to come visit. And that's something that you might want to consider if that's something in your sort of wheelhouse of having friends and family visiting you overseas. A third consideration is, what is the local language? Do you already speak it? Or is it something that you can pick up? Is it something that will be very challenging, very difficult? Because on a day-to-day basis, it will really help you if you do know some of the local language. And so that's something to consider. And then the new friendships, so a lot of us move overseas because we want to learn about new cultures. And how easily can you make friends in the local culture? I've seen countries where it's very difficult. They're very isolating, and they don't want, say, necessarily foreigners in their circle. And I've seen the opposite. I've seen where the local culture is very welcoming, and a, a blend of many cultures, and they're very open to new friendships and new relationships with foreigners. So that's all kind of thrown into the consideration of location. The safety is something to really consider. And then I've sort of broken it into different categories. So you might have actual physical danger, you might have crime, you might have some kind of harassment. I'm a single female, and so I do consider that kind of thing before I look into moving to a new country. How safe will I feel walking on the street, or driving my car? So this is something that you want to do a little bit of research about. The second one is air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution. So air pollution, we all know some of the countries come to mind immediately when we think about the quality of air and having to buy those air filters or air filtration systems. Water pollution, unfortunately, a lot of countries you can't drink the tap water, and you can't swim in the water because it might be also polluted. So that's something to consider if you're a big water fan as far as like water sports. And then noise pollution, big cities overseas can have a lot of honking cars, a lot of traffic, and a lot of um, salespeople. So I actually think it's very charming. In Guadalajara, Mexico, I love the salespeople coming down the street. I know the knife sharpener. I know the sweet potato man. I know the corn man. So I think it's sort of part of the charm of living overseas, but it can be daunting for some people that are used to a lot quieter things. And then the third consideration is traffic. So if you have to have a commute to school, what will the commute look like? Will it be provided for you? So a little shuttle bus or private pickup, or will you have to take public transportation or figure out how to get to the school? Um, if you end up getting a car and you want to go from one end of the city to the other, this is something to consider as well. Like, how easy is that? If you're isolated out in the countryside, and the whole cultural restaurant life is in the city, and you live outside, how long will that take you? So that's something to consider. And then, from a safety perspective, what is the poverty level? Will you be sort of looking at the crime rate? Will you be harassed or asked for money on a regular basis? And this can be draining in some cases, because we do earn a lot of money compared to the local economy. And so that's something to consider. Um, how tolerant, I guess, are you of that kind of day-to-day situation? So, another thing to consider is your physical and mental health. So, from a physical perspective, what is the medical care like? In some countries, you might need to actually get flown out if it was some kind of important surgery. They might not have it in country. Um, Most of the times, your medical care is covered. It might just be covered for the country. It might be covered for the whole world minus United States. And then I've seen the whole world, including the United States. So I've seen all three types of medical insurance. So that's something you want to ask about. What kind of medical coverage do you have? And then what kind of medical care can you expect? It may not be in English. You might not be able to find a dentist or a doctor who speaks English. So in which case, then it goes back to how much assistance do you have with HR translating or an educational assistant coming with you and translating with your dentist or your doctor. For your physical health as well, are your hobbies and your interests. So are you an avid uh, equestrian? Do you have horseback riding as an option, or is that not even a possibility? So looking at what do you like to do and seeing if that is still possible in your new country. And of course, you will discover new ones, but it would be nice if they had some of the ones that you also like. Travel opportunities. So, this is a bit physical, but more mental health. I'm thinking things like how easy is it to travel around the country or to leave the country and have a little mental break from that country. Sometimes with border closures and now with COVID restrictions and quarantine, it can be really daunting to be in that country for a long period of time. So so that becomes the local travel opportunities become really important for that reason. And then for your mental health are new friendships. So I mentioned local friendships, getting to know some of the locals, um, getting to make friendships outside of school is always really healthy for a balance so that you're not only talking to school teachers from your school. So how easy is it to find other expat groups or other groups that have share the same interests and same hobbies that you have? Um, and so these are all very different considerations, but with the physical and mental health in mind. So your ninth factor or a ninth factor is a sense of purpose. So we often come overseas or we go overseas because we have something to share. We have knowledge, we have culture to share with the world. And part of that is becoming a valued staff member. So do we feel like um, our sense of purpose of moving overseas is being met, and are we making the world a better place? Are we making our students lives better by being there and by teaching them? And then does the school therefore appreciate what we're bringing to the table? And so that's something to consider and something to ask about. How do they show their appreciation? And then the other thing I was thinking about with sense of purpose is, what is your interaction with the local community? Many times with IB schools, especially, but even other curricula, they're starting to add that component of um, social. Uh, oh my goodness, am I okay? I have 10 minutes. Okay, so the social aspect of charities and helping in the community. So not only for students, but also for yourself. If you're someone who's an avid volunteer, would you have that opportunity to help out? And then the 10th one is talking about money. So would you have enough money in this new school to maintain or to even upgrade your lifestyle? Um, would you have enough to um, afford an expensive cost of living? Many of these countries nowadays have an extremely high cost of living comparatively to our home countries. And so the salary needs to reflect that. And if it doesn't, then you're going to feel that you're working out of a budget, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's something to consider. The third thing is, do they have an opportunity for you to earn more money? So many times your visa, your work visa is tied only with the school and you can't work anywhere else. You can't tutor outside, you can't work or moonlight at another school. So does your school offer coaching stipends or extracurricular stipends? This would be an opportunity to make a little bit more money. And then the biggest consideration is, can I save for the future? Oftentimes, if we're going overseas, we don't have retirement packages at home if we haven't worked a number of years back in our home country. So this is our retirement package. We need to be able to save for the future. So do you have that opportunity with this new international school that you're considering? So I'm just going to show you the 10 factors. And as I say, I will share this PDF, this presentation in a PDF form and email it to you. But this is a nice little screenshot to sort of consider 10 factors you might not have considered when choosing an international school. And so now is the time for our